Great. Well, hi everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the Academic Special Interest Group discussion event. We're really excited to have Tom Moorhouse speaking tonight about his book, Ghosts in the Hedgerow. Tom's an ecologist and author who for over 22 years worked for the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit Wild Crew at Oxford, and who now works as an independent researcher. His research began with single species conservation issues, including water voles, signal crayfish and hedgehogs, and moved on to methods for reducing global demand for wildlife products, an area in which he still works. His authorial career has comprised a number of children's books, including the award-winning The River Singers, The Rising and Trickster, all of which drew on ecological knowledge of water voles and rats, and his adult non-fiction comprises Elegy for River and Ghosts in the Hedgerow, which we're about to hear from. So over to you, Tom.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak. So this is going to be a short talk based on this book, Ghosts in the Hedgerow, which what I was essentially trying to do with this book is to communicate what is quite a tricky conservation issue to sort of intelligent lay audience. And I guess, so what I really want to achieve in this sort of talk and sort of in the discussion afterwards is to raise the questions of, basically to tell you something about hedgehog conservation and sort of what the state of play is there, but also to sort of say there are some conservation issues that are not straightforward, and how would you go about communicating those not straightforward bits to people who are interested but who don't have sort of specialist knowledge in ecology and conservation. And I guess this whole talk is it's a very short version of my book, in which I attempted to use quite kind of a slightly novel format in order to do that. So I guess one of the twin aims is just to sort of demonstrate my take on how you go about doing that, communicating to a lay audience who are sort of interested in the topic. So
Tom, can I stop you and say, could you move your view of attendees from the middle of the screen?
Oh, I didn't realize you could see that. I do apologize. You know, I'll put that right over there. How's that looking?
Fab. Thank you.
Okay, great stuff. Great. Okay. Okay, so can you read the title there? Is that visible? Yeah, okay. Anyway, so essentially I've framed hedgehog conservation as a murder mystery. This is the scene. We're at Hotel Furzodge, and this is the croquet lawn. And ladies and gentlemen, I am appalled and devastated to inform you that there has been a murder. We have drawn a chalk outline of the murdered individual on the croquet lawn. And because this is a murder mystery, we have in the library, obviously the chalk outline is of one of these, which is a European hedgehog doing his favorite thing, which is, you know, eating worms, because he's a fairly omnivorous insectivore. And we have in the library of Hotel Furzodge assembled a short list of potential suspects who may or may not have been involved in this hedgehog's murder. And so what we're going to do in very short order is interrogate each one of these suspects to see the degree to which they may or may not be involved in the murder of this particular hedgehog, or indeed the entire population of British hedgehogs. So suspect number one, it will surprise none of you to learn, is Mr. Clarkson, the chauffeur. You may spot as we're going on that some of the names are, you know, may or may not refer to individuals who have some sort of notoriety in these respective fields. So this is Mr. Clarkson, who likes to drive cars. And as we all know, you know, there are lots of jokes. Why did the hedgehog cross the road? You know what the punchline is. You know, these jokes exist for a reason. And that reason is that whenever you have a hedgehog and it meets a motor vehicle, there is rather obviously a sad outcome for the hedgehog involved. And we know that cars kill hedgehogs. We know that cars kill hedgehogs in vast numbers. What we don't know is whether those vast numbers of cars meeting vast numbers of hedgehogs is sufficient to cause a decline in the population. So do we have any evidence? Well, if you were to pick up any newspaper article on the subject of hedgehog conservation, and indeed, if you were to pick up many books on the subject of hedgehog conservation, you will see essentially a variant of this graph. This graph says that in the 1950s, there were something like 36 million hedgehogs roaming around the UK. Fast forward to the 1990s, and the best national population estimate we had was somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million hedgehogs. And in the 2020s, that population estimate has dropped to about 500,000 hedgehogs in Great Britain. At the same time, the number of motor vehicles has had the exact inverse trend. So in the 1950s, we had less than 5 million motor vehicles on the road. Now we've got nearly 35 million vehicles on the road. So there appears to be a very suspicious inverse correlation in the number of cars around and the number of hedgehogs around. And of course, we know that cars do kill hedgehogs. In fact, the numbers of hedgehogs that they kill is fairly substantial. So if we look at the population estimate from the 1990s, and this was a national population estimate, the number of road deaths was, I'm going to have to lead around the corner here, 230,000 road deaths. And that's from a population estimate of something like 1 million to 1.5 million. So that's somewhere between a quarter and, maybe up to a quarter and an eighth of all the hedgehogs around. That's a lot, obviously. And if we look at the number of road deaths that were recorded in the early 2000s, that's somewhere between 170,000 and 340,000 road deaths. And that's from a national population that's estimated as being in the region of 500,000. So that's a huge proportion of the existing hedgehogs are getting killed on the roads. And if you take these data and look at these trends, then you just say, fine, that's it. That's my talk done. I've proved my point. It's cars. We don't need the other suspects. I don't know what we're going to do with the other 25 minutes, frankly. But there's a problem, which is that these data are completely unreliable. And they're completely unreliable for reasons that don't necessarily seem to be fairly obvious. You can imagine if you're trying to communicate this issue to people who don't know much about how surveys work, you're in a lot of trouble, because the numbers count for themselves, speak for themselves. So let's start by looking at that 1950s population estimate of hedgehogs, the 36 million. Where it comes from is a book by Maurice Burton from 1969. The book's called The Hedgehog. And this paragraph says, in the 1950s, I ventured an estimate of the size of the average density of hedgehogs throughout the country as 1 per acre. A survey in Germany gave an average of 1 hedgehog per 25 acres. This discrepancy merely emphasized the difficulty of making an accurate count. So Maurice Burton basically, one night, and this is absolutely true, one night in the 1950s, he went for a walk in Kew Gardens and he saw 10 hedgehogs, and he reckoned he'd covered 10 acres. And so he went, okay, it's about 1 hedgehog per acre. And he didn't do anything with that population estimate or that density estimate of hedgehogs. The only thing he did with it is put this in his book saying, look, it's almost impossible to make an accurate count. In the 1990s, what happened is, because this was the only piece of sort of information that we had from that time, we basically multiplied the 1 hedgehog per acre by the number of acres of suitable hedgehog habitat in the country and got 36 million hedgehogs, which is clearly absolutely ridiculous, because if he hadn't seen any hedgehogs, we wouldn't conclude that we didn't have any hedgehogs in the UK. If he'd seen 5, we'd have come up with half the number of hedgehogs. It's absolutely insane to use that as a population statistic. So if we go back to this graph, that first bar there, 36 million hedgehogs, completely worthless It's based on one guy who went for a walk one night in Kew Gardens. You cannot use that. And yet that statistic gets quoted. And there are very similar problems with other national surveys of hedgehogs, simply because there are never enough studies funded to give an accurate density estimate of hedgehogs. As we all know, hedgehogs move around a lot. It's almost impossible to go all the places they're going and to get a really accurate estimate of the number of hedgehogs in one place, and then to multiply that up by the habitat in the UK simply doesn't work. So basically, all of these blue lines are very, very suspect indeed. So do we know if hedgehogs have even declined? Well, we've got 3 other sources of information that would help us find out. We have game bag surveys, which basically asking gamekeepers what they've been trapping, and they've been trapping hedgehogs, throughout the whole of the 20th century and prior to that. And those do indeed show a decline in hedgehog numbers in gamekeepers' game bags. Now, there's a difficulty with relying on those surveys, and the difficulty is that in 1981 it became illegal to trap hedgehogs. And so, as you'd expect, there's quite a steep decline in gamekeepers recording hedgehogs being collected in their game bags. So it was illegal to capture them by accident, but even so, it's become progressively less socially acceptable for people to admit to accidentally or even deliberately killing hedgehogs. And so there's a big problem with the game bag surveys. Also, there are fewer gamekeepers, and it's very dependent on the amount of effort they're putting in. So it's really, even though there's a decline shown in the number of hedgehogs in game bag surveys, you can't really rely on it. The British Trust for Ornithology breeding bird surveys, as the name suggests, are surveys looking at breeding birds, but they also record some species of mammals, including hedgehogs. The difficulty there is that the surveys tend to take place in daylight, and hedgehogs are largely nocturnal, so you're not always going to be picking them up. And they really rely on the expertise of the people involved, going back to the same places again and again, and being able to pick up signs of hedgehogs, footprints and droppings and things like that. And those breeding bird surveys also show a decline, but it's not necessarily all that reliable because they're not looking for hedgehogs. It turns out that our best evidence that we've even had a decline in hedgehog numbers come from roadkill surveys. The advantage of a roadkill survey, the obvious disadvantage to hedgehogs getting hit by cars is that at the end of it, you have a dead hedgehog, and that's bad for the population. The advantage is that a dead hedgehog has the benefit of staying still long enough to be counted, and that makes roadkill surveys relatively accurate. And you can get the public involved in roadkill surveys, as the People's Trust for Endangered Species and Hedgehog Street have done. And you can get people out there, they record the hedgehogs, and we get the data. So with roadkill surveys, the kind of baseline information we have from 1994, as a sort of rough approximation, we had something along the lines of 2 hedgehogs per kilometre. By the time we got to 10 years later, 2004, we were getting 1.45 hedgehogs per kilometre. Another 10 years later, we're down to essentially half a hedgehog per kilometre, and it's stayed pretty much there ever since. And according to roadkill survey data, we've lost something like 70% of our hedgehogs. So I've started with suspect number 1, who's Mr. Clarkson, but what we've seen from the roadkill data is that, sure, there looks like there has genuinely been a decline in hedgehogs. Have we been able to say that cars are the main thing responsible for that? No. And there's one good argument for that not being the case, which is that the type of hedgehog that tend to get killed by cars tend to be male hedgehogs, especially during the breeding season when males get filled up with testosterone and decide to rove around looking for female hedgehogs. That makes them far more prone to getting run over. And so there's a big skew in terms of the sex ratio of dead hedgehogs on the roads. They tend to be males, which is bad for male hedgehogs. But in terms of the impact on the hedgehog population, as you can imagine, The ones that you don't want to get hit are the females, because you lose a female hedgehog, you lose all of her progeny in perpetuity. Whereas if there's just one male hedgehog left in an area, but all the female hedgehogs are intact, that one male hedgehog will be very tired and can't believe his luck, but he will be able to impregnate all of those females, and the hedgehog population will probably do quite well. So it's plausible that although cars are, they're clearly having an impact on hedgehogs, we're having hundreds of thousands killed every year, they may not be the #1 cause of hedgehogs going extinct. So let's look at suspect number 2. And you could probably hazard a guess from the shape that suspect number 2 is Tommy Brock the badger. So badgers and hedgehogs have a difficult relationship. In fact, they have they exhibit asymmetric intra-guild competition, which in layman's terms means that they eat the same stuff. Badgers, as you probably know, are super specialists on eating earthworms, and hedgehogs absolutely love to eat earthworms. Badgers also eat a whole bunch of other invertebrates, which hedgehogs love to eat. They're also bigger than hedgehogs and therefore able to bully them into not going anywhere near these food sources. The really asymmetrical part of the intra-guild relationship here is that if a badger gets very hungry, it will do this to a hedgehog, which is that it's one of the few animals strong enough to uncurl a hedgehog and eat the bit in the middle, just sort of leaving the skin behind. And so not only do badgers eat the same food as hedgehogs, but they also eat the hedgehogs themselves. And the result of this is very apparent when you look at hedgehogs' behavior. What these pictures are Anushka Hoff's project from 2012, where they were radio tracking hedgehogs in sort of rural sites at the top there where there were no badgers present, and the 2 sites at the bottom where there were badgers present. And each one of these dots is where they radio tracked a hedgehog. And the thing to pay attention to is the number of hedgehogs in the fields. So in sort of graph A there and graph B, in picture A and B, you can see the hedgehogs are all around the fields. In C, they basically, none of the hedgehogs ever left the village and went into the fields. That's where with badgers around, they did not leave the village. The village is the sort of white stuff. And if you look in D, although the hedgehogs are in the fields, they're sticking to the margins. They're not going into the field centres. They're mainly in the village, and they're mainly around the houses and mainly around the margins. And that's the impact that badgers have on hedgehog behaviour. They clearly scare hedgehogs into sticking by the hedges because badgers find it difficult to hunt in hedges. And if you look at Williams's study from 2018, they looked at 261 1-kilometre sites in England and Wales. And they found that in the sites without badgers, about 30% of sites had hedgehogs. In the sites with badgers, it was about 17% of sites had hedgehogs. And that looks fairly conclusive in terms of, they clearly don't like to share with badgers very much. So could it be that badgers are responsible for driving hedgehogs to extinction? Well, there are a few reasons to suspect that it's not that badgers are not the principal reason. Firstly, badgers and hedgehogs have coexisted for tens of thousands of years. And all of a sudden, this has become a problem. Seems unlikely. Secondly, in Williams's study, there were 55 sites out of the 261 sites where they found hedgehogs present. And badgers were also present at half of those, and they were coexisting perfectly happily. The other fairly telling reason is that at the sites without badgers, only 30% of those sites were occupied. That means that 70% of the rural sites that they looked at in Great Britain did not have hedgehogs, despite there being no badgers. That rather suggests there's something else wrong with those sites. So what could that be? Well, this is where we get to suspect number 3, who is Major Gedov, the landowner. I kind of have to apologize for these names, so that might have been drunk when I was making them up or something. Anyway, So to sort of talk about major good of the landowner, I want to sort of scroll us out a little bit to take a sort of a wider view. So this is a view of the planet Earth. You may recognize it, and that over there is the moon. How is this relevant to hedgehogs? Well, did you know that the average distance between the Earth and the moon is 384,000 kilometers? Put another way, and I didn't realize this until I started writing the book. You could fit every single planet in our solar system between the Earth and the moon, which I think is an amazing fact, and that's something I'm sort of that lives rent-free in my head. This is relevant to hedgehogs simply because this green line here is the amount of hedgerow that Britain lost between 1940 and the 1990s. I say the amount we lost, I mean the amount we deliberately removed. We removed 600,000 kilometers of hedgerow from Great Britain in, essentially 50 years. Now, the word hedgehog is not a joke name. Hedgehogs love to live in hedges. They're a fairly small, fairly omnivorous insectivore that likes to live in hedges. Hedges provide them with nesting sites, shelter from predation from badgers, shelter during the daytime. It's how they navigate around the countryside. They contain a lot of invertebrates that hedgehogs love to eat. As I've said, badgers find it very difficult to hunt for hedgehogs in hedges. So hedges mediate the interaction between hedgehogs and badgers in two ways. Firstly, by providing invertebrates so that badgers are less likely to want to eat the hedgehogs, and secondly, by making it more difficult for them to be got at. Hedges are warmer than the surrounding countryside. They're all basically, these are the hedgehogs' homes in the wider rural areas of Great Britain. And we removed 600,000 kilometers of hedgehogs' homes. Is there any wonder that there's been a decline? Worse still is the number of different types of pesticides that we're using in the UK. So there were about 3 or 4 different types of pesticide in general usage in the 1930s. That's up to about 300 and something different types of pesticide now. And the total area being sprayed with pesticides has gone up to 3 million hectares every single year, up from a baseline of essentially 0 in the 1930s. And if you look at the number of tractors and combine harvesters in use, this has also gone up. These compact the soil, very bad for invertebrate taxon richness and invertebrate numbers. So between 1970 and 1990, this loss of invertebrates had quite an impact. If you look at bird species, between the 1970 and 1990, in Fuller's and work, we saw 24 of 28 different bird species contracting their ranges, and 15 of 18 bird species declining in abundance. And between 1968 and 1995, 11 of 13 specialist farmland bird species halved in numbers. And we saw similar declines in insects and arthropods on farmland. To put all this another way, farmland invertebrates have declined. Farmland invertebrate-eating birds have also declined. And this is not just happening in the UK, it's global. It's happening all over Northern Europe. It's in North America, lost 3 billion birds over 48 years, about a third of all of the birds it had in the 1970s. And the same is happening to hedgehogs. Anything that relies on eating farmland invertebrates is in steep decline. And yet again, we removed all that hedgehog habitat, we've removed all that hedgehog food. And this has resulted in a situation in which the last refuges for hedgehogs are our towns and villages. The countryside has become incredibly unfriendly to British hedgehogs. Suspect number 4, Mrs. Nimby's local parishioner, who lives in a nice village and owns one of these. This is a robot lawnmower. And one of my friends and colleagues did a study on robot lawnmowers. So these are very popular in the continent. They can mow your lawn for you. Now, bear in mind that in a lot of our towns, including, I'm in the middle of Oxford, for those of you who don't know, and we have hedgehogs around here. And so basically, anything you do in your garden is likely to influence hedgehogs. These things, to give you a very brief example of what they can do. I mean, so Sophie Rasmussen was worried that robot lawnmowers may have an impact on hedgehogs, and so she worked with the industry to sort of get a load of previously deceased hedgehogs and array them in front of some robot lawnmowers to see what would happen, essentially. And a lot of them basically mowed straight over the top of the hedgehogs. And if those had been live hedgehogs or hedgehogs with hoglets, they would have been severely, severely injured. I don't have time to give you the full anecdote. I can later in the discussion if you want, but the way she describes it is pretty grisly. Add to that people strimming, horrific injuries, electric fences, very well known for killing hedgehogs, especially those that have a sort of netting type. You know, if most animals run away from electric fence, hedgehogs, because they curl up, tend to just sit there and get shocked. Slug pellets, you end up with poisonous slugs. Gardens like this are absolutely worthless for wildlife in general, especially hedgehogs. Firstly, there's no way of getting in. Even if they could get in, what is there to eat? What is there to do? Where is there that they could possibly shelter? And these, especially since COVID, and especially since the various locks down, these are becoming far more the norm than they possibly should be. So there is something like 22.7 million gardens in Britain covering 4,330 square kilometers. That's enough space for somewhere between 40,000 and 140,000 hedgehogs, otherwise known as 2,000 to 4,000 stable hedgehog populations. You know, if our towns and villages and gardens are the last refuges of hedgehogs, that's the fallback position. But between 2003 and 2013, we lost about 25% of our urban hedgehog populations, but we don't know from what baseline. We don't know what was happening in the 1970s compared with 2003. We don't only really started looking at this in 2003. So this, what you're looking at here is essentially my house. My house is just next to the bottom arrow there where it says no hedgehogs in 10 years. That's the road I live on, Charles Street. In my neighbours on Percy Street, which is the arrow above, they see hedgehogs in their garden every single night. Now, I've never seen a hedgehog in 10 years of living in my house. And as you can see, this is a fairly normal sort of Victorian terrace. So what's happened is that the houses are arranged in a rectangle, and in the middle of the gardens, and those gardens are brilliant hedgehog habitat. They're warm, they're relatively safe, they're relatively full of food. But they're disconnected from each other because lots of people have got brand new fences and things like that going across there. And the reason that, if you have a look, zoom in on my garden, as you can see, there are those fences, and those fences are all pretty much impenetrable. If you look at the fences on Percy Street, what they used to be when these houses were first built is a road running down the back where all the toilets were, essentially, so you could access the back of those houses. On Percy Street, that road still exists, or the remnants of it do, and that's how the hedgehogs are getting into people's gardens. And so all of that habitat in the middle of all of those houses is available to the hedgehogs. On my street, it is not available because that road has disappeared. Essentially, there's all this hedgehog habitat in all of our towns and cities that is becoming progressively less accessible to hedgehogs. And doing something about that is extraordinarily easy, as you can imagine. You just put holes in fences. And persuading people to do that is an incredibly, well, it sounds conceptually very, very, very simple. And I have more to say about things that sound conceptually very simple in terms of conservation in the discussion. So essentially, if you're looking at suspect number 4 here, our local parishioner, well, she's probably responsible for gardens that look like this, which look very neat, very orderly, very pretty, but which are absolutely worthless for a lot of wildlife forget pollinators, forget anything else, and definitely forget about having hedgehogs in places like this. There are definitely solutions. A garden that's good for wildlife, as you all know, looks more like this. And you can do that anywhere, including right in the middle of London, if you wish to. So these things can be reversed. We can definitely rewild in urban landscapes, and we desperately need to. So in my book, I give an example of my friend Chris's garden. He bought a house with just your normal 1930s garden. It was something like, I think he said it was 9 by 9 meters, something along those lines, and there was nothing in there, and he rewilded it. And within a few months of him sort of turning it over to nature, he was recording hedgehogs coming in for the first time. And again, just to re-emphasize his point, how they were getting into his garden was they had to squeeze under the gate, because they didn't have any other way of getting in. So that's how they were getting in and out, but it was worth them doing that. And so there's definitely a lot to be said for connectivity in gardens. So I've taken you on a whirlwind tour of hedgehog conservation across the impacts of cars, badgers, the agricultural intensification, and what we are doing as individuals in our own homes. And the unsurprising conclusion is that all of these factors are responsible together in combination for the parlous state of hedgehog conservation in the UK. So I have some questions to pose to you for discussion going forwards. So I guess the question number one is, what are we collectively going to do about the state of hedgehogs in the UK? What can we do? Question number two is, there's been a sort of recurring theme here is how difficult it has been to even prove a decline either in rural areas nationally or in urban areas. How important are baseline data in situations like this? And do we need them in order to act? And how do we set about deriving them? And my third question is, if we were going to try and communicate, I mean, hedgehogs are a very complicated situation because everyone thinks they know why they're declining, but actually it's a combination of lots of different things all taking a chunk out of the population. How do we communicate complicated issues like this in a way that people can really get behind? So I'm going to leave you with those questions and say thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Would anyone like to respond to any of Tom's questions? Would you like to, will we see you if you raise your hand? Maybe unmute yourself and shout out.
By the way, I hope you can't hear. I have a 4-year-old daughter who's sounding very unhappy in the other room, so you may or may not be able to hear that.
We can't hear her, Tom.
That's a relief.
Well, if we're not getting, I mean, we've got nearly 60 people here, so hopefully some of them are going to talk to us. I
think we have a question on the comments.
We have a question in the comments. Oh, well, even in the questions. Would approaching new build developers help with regards to putting hedgeway highways in?
Hedgehog highways in. So yes, it would. So new build developers are among some of the worst for not doing that. And there is a really lovely anecdote that I was given by Hugh Warwick, and I put it in the end of the book, about this guy, I forget his name, and I shouldn't have done. But anyway, he was so appalled by his sort of local developers sort of taking over a field that was full of hedgehogs and sort of building houses where all of the gardens have been segregated, that he wrote them a letter saying, please don't do this. And they ignored him. So he wrote another letter and they ignored him. And he kept writing letters until they basically gave in and said, fine, okay, we'll start putting hedgehog highways in. And it was just very polite, but very persistent letter writing from one individual that changed a sort of national policy for one particular developer. Now, that's not the case for all developers. And I think there's a piece of legislation that's going through that's going to hopefully force developers to put in hedgehog highways. But, that would absolutely help, yeah. But of course, new builds are just one part of it. I mean, there are a lot of existing homes where people are just updating fences the whole time and just therefore shutting off their gardens.
Yes. Now, the hedgehog highways are, of course, being promoted by PTES and Hedgehog Street, aren't they?
They are.
And presumably by the Hedgehog Preservation Society as well, because there is an active and various local groups, I expect, as well.
Yeah.
Michael is asking, with the growing dog pet ownership in the UK, what effect has this had on hedgehog populations?
I don't think that dogs are a massive problem for hedgehogs. I mean, hedgehogs can just kind of roll up and sort of deal with it. I mean, and similarly, I think cats might be a bit more of a problem. I I don't think it's a huge issue. I think the issue tends to be the other stuff they're doing, like strimming hedgehogs. That I think a dog's very unlikely to, especially because dogs don't tend to be out when hedgehogs are around anyway, in the middle of the night. Cats more so, but again, they have defenses. I mean, it's not helpful, but I don't think anyone thinks it's a major issue. Look at it that way. More of a major issue, just coming back to the hedgehog highways again, is just persuading anybody to build these things. There have been studies performed by Reading University in particular, who they basically tried to get hedgehog people to sign up to put hedgehog highways in to see how much more accessible it made their gardens. They got all these people to say, yes, I'm going to put one in. And the number of people who actually did it over a 6-month period was, I think, one person. Because lots and lots of people say, yes, absolutely, I'm going to do that. But then they have to talk to the neighbors. And these are difficult conversations to have with your neighbors. Can I put a hole in the fence? Why do you want to do that? Yeah, okay, fair enough. And it doesn't happen because, we've all got so much on our plates. So getting the things put in. Sorry.
And people think rats will go through the holes as well.
Yes, which is ridiculous because rats, I mean, I've had rats at the bottom of my garden. They're not going through the fence; they're going under the fence in their burrow systems. It's again, whether you put a hole for a hedgehog is irrelevant to a rat. Is like they will happily build their own burrows.
Right, and Jasmine says, are there any ideas on practical ways to more accurately track hedgehog populations?
It's incredibly difficult. It comes down to funding to track hedgehog populations. Because hedgehogs are so mobile, there are animals that will happily cover, many kilometers in a night. And so if you want to get an idea of how many hedgehogs you have in, say, in a couple of square kilometers, it's a lot of work. And those hedgehogs may not be resident in those couple of square kilometers you're looking at. They may be resident somewhere else and just passing through, So you need to be radio tracking individuals. And, on animals like hedgehogs, things like satellite tags don't work brilliantly because they spend a lot of time under sheds and, living cryptically, under bushes and things like that. So I mean, tracking hedgehogs, yeah, we can do it. It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of money, and there isn't a lot of money available to do this, which is why we can't get an accurate population estimate, because there are never any more than 4 or 5 sort of hedgehog density studies in a given area over an X number of year period, and therefore you can't multiply that up to a sort of national population estimate with any degree of reliability. So I don't think, I mean, unless you're getting everybody involved in footprint tunnels and sort of garden surveys, then there aren't really any better ideas than just mobilizing the public.
Yes. Sophie asks, how do you feel about people feeding hedgehogs? Do you think it's sustainable in the long term, or is a natural wildlife garden better for them?
I think it's sustainable. I mean, I think the hedgehogs are very happy about it. I think it's great for hedgehog populations. The only potential downside is if you stop feeding them, if you see what I mean. So I've anecdotally hear of people, there's a suspicion that if you carry on feeding them in the winter, for example, they delay hibernation because they've got a lot of food available. And so if you're sort of feeding them into the winter and then you sort of stop, then you might actually sort of do the population some harm simply because they might run out of food when they've decided not to hibernate. Um, but I don't think there's a problem with people feeding them at all. I think that's a fine thing to do, and they need all the help they can get. A natural wildlife garden is is great and great for everything else, and persuading your sort of friends and neighbors to do the same, absolutely even better. But no problem with feeding them. Sustainable long term, I don't know, because people move house, it's, I think it doesn't do any harm. Whether it's going to save for hedgehogs, I don't know.
No, and of course that touches on the climate change issue, doesn't it?
Mm,
And the whole,
yes.
which we haven't spoken about, but I'm sure we're all aware of. Haley says, should people be encouraged to cut hedgehog doorways in their fences? But I think you've answered that
Yep, absolutely. Please
clearly.
do.
Austin says, what are the major legislation gaps that are needed to be
Um,
filled to help hedgehogs?
oh, I think they basically need to be given full protection, as does their habitat. And definitely sort of, if it would be nice to think that we could mandate putting holes in fences in new builds. That surely shouldn't be beyond the wit of man, but I'm not sure it's happened yet. But yeah, and I think this touches on Craig's next question, which is, I think legal
Yes.
protection can be strengthened. And there was, you may recall there was going to be a charge to save hedgehogs a while ago. There was a big and I forget the name of the politician in question, but that charge never materialized. It was while I was writing the book, and there's going to be a big charge. We'd strengthen the legislation. Hedgehogs would be saved as a result. Um, the charge never happened, and even if it had, I think more is needed than just strengthening legislation. I think we need to engage people with thinking, this everybody loves hedgehogs. They are Britain's most loved species. If we can't save them, we're in deep trouble with all of the other species that need saving, especially because it is literally this is in our sphere of influence. We can't always influence national policy for wildlife. We can influence what happens in our own back garden. Every single day we can do that. And that's all that we all collectively need to do to save hedgehogs and sort of prevent a conservation catastrophe. And yet we're not doing it. And so we need to engage people as well as sort of solving the sort of political side of it.
But of course, if you had holes in every fence, there's nothing to stop people putting things against the holes and blocking them.
No, there
So
isn't.
it's kind of, it's better to persuade people. Sarah, you had your hand up a while ago. Do you want to unmute and ask your question or make your comment? Perhaps it's been answered as we're going through the questions and answers. Someone who's anonymous has said, is the more erratic changes in weather before and after hibernation considered to impact hedgehogs?
I don't know is a simple answer to that question. I can't imagine it helps, but yeah, I don't know. I don't have enough sort of information to answer that. I'm sure that somewhere there's a hedgehog ecologist screaming at me, but yeah, I would suspect that it does, but I would suspect that it's a lot of things with hedgehogs have become the straw that breaks the camel's back. I think this is probably in that territory, if you see what I mean. If all of the other, if we'd sorted out the hedgerows. I mean, that's an obvious one we haven't discussed, incidentally, is that what we should be doing is putting back hedgerow by the bucket load, and that would sort out a heck of a lot of hedgehog problems, you know.
And I'm going to
then we wouldn't
interrupt
need to worry
there
about
and
this.
say planting hedgerows is not enough, because
No.
the number of hedgerows I see which are planted and then managed by flailing or cutting and are
Yeah.
completely bare at the bottom.
Yeah.
We need to go back to planting dense hedges that are dense at the bottom to benefit
Absolutely.
hedgehogs. So
Yeah.
if we're not doing hedge laying and leaving margins so you get some undergrowth at the bottom, then it's not that helpful.
No. And if you're just measuring the sheer quantity of hedgerow, it doesn't say anything about the quality of that hedgerow. I agree entirely.
No, exactly. Yeah, and that new CEH survey of hedgerows that's been done using LiDAR data that came out, did it come out last week or the week before? It's very hard to get hold of and doesn't really help a lot with management. Yeah, and the next question is, are there any practical means of reducing road casualties? For example, are tunnels viable?
Yes. The difficulty is, though, that roads are not they're not homogeneous in terms of their impacts on hedgehogs. The impact of a particular stretch of road depends a lot upon landscape surrounding it. So I was talking to Lauren Moore, who has worked a lot on sort of road casualties, hedgehogs, and farmland. And she was saying that there's one stretch outside of one village where she was working. There's just like a 40-meter stretch where all the hedgehogs get killed. And the reason for that is that the landscape funnels them down to hedges just either side of that road, and that's where they cross the road. And it just so happens that that's sort of round a blind bend where the cars are still going quite quickly out of the village. And so it's very difficult to predict where you're going to need to put those tunnels in order for them to be effective. You need to have a really good grasp on how hedgehogs are moving around the landscape. And so that's work that's ongoing. But it's not good enough. I mean, we don't have the money to just put tunnels every 10 meters or so, which definitely solve the problem. But, who's going to give us that money? And so if we have to target it, then we have to target it really carefully and understand what it is about the surrounding landscape that would make a tunnel effective. But so the answer is not yet, but I think it's a work in progress.
Yes. And of course, there's nothing to say the hedgehogs would necessarily go down the tunnel if it was provided.
Yeah.
Which is what has been found with other things. Lorna says, with elms and BNG, I hope we will see more hedgerows on farmland in future. However, I imagine drainage ditches and hedgerows more than hedgerows in farmland. Of course, that might not mean to be a more than sign. There is an impact on the ability of hedgehogs to travel in certain parts of farmland in the country. Are there ways for them to cross? I mean, is that a question about how well hedgehogs can swim?
And
because
just
they're quite
barriers
good
to
at it, aren't
dispersal. They are, but what they're really bad at is climbing out the other side, having swum. So a lot of hedgehogs die in garden ponds for exactly this reason, which is they get in and then they can't get out because they're bad at climbing out of water up a step. And so I think that drainage ditches have the benefit of having really nice margins often, and hedgehogs use those for sort of foraging and navigation. So, anything that's across a ditch will help. So part of my own studies on hedgehogs, I simulated what would happen if we started putting hedgerows back to see what impact that would have on hedgehogs' ability to move around a habitat. And we basically found that if you double the number of hedges, it would have a huge impact on the ability of hedgehogs to sort of disperse around obstacles, basically, in a habitat. Any more than that, and you don't get a sort of concomitant increase in their ability to disperse. So I think hedgerows definitely important. Drainage ditches, I think, have their own benefits. And it doesn't take much to make them crossable. You just put a plank across them, I think.
Okay. Joe says, where is best to send hedgehog roadkill data? But where we've only got 9 minutes and we've got quite a few more questions.
Okay, that's okay. This one's easy. PTS Mammals on Road survey. Sign up. There's an app, and it's not only hedgehog roadkill data, all sorts of roadkill data you can put in there. And more people who sign up, the better. PTS Mammals on Roads.
Yeah. Miles says, would you prefer to see hedgehog conservation focused on urban areas or on unsuitable countryside sites, encouraging re-establishment?
I think that both. I think that urban areas, that's largely in the I think we can do both simply because there are different things required. In urban areas, it requires less money and it requires more talking to people and persuading them to change what they're doing in their homes and gardens and what the councils are doing in parks. So that's often saving councils money, by the way, encouraging them to mow less often, things like that. And then I'd like to see the money spent on actually sort of putting things back as they should be in suitable and less suitable countryside sites. I think that even if a site is suitable, it doesn't mean it's optimal. And there are definite improvements you can make in places that do have hedgehogs, you know. So both.
Kira says, isn't there a concern against feeding stations as areas of disease transmission?
I mean, hedgehogs tend to aggregate and sort of come and go anyway. I don't think it's as big a problem as hedgehogs starving to death. And if they have access to your garden and they're tending to aggregate around feeding stations, then I think that's fine. And you know, at some point they have to go near each other to breed anyway. I don't think there's so much of a. I don't think that anybody's particularly concerned about that. Not that I'm aware of anyway.
No, that probably comes from the concern about bird feeders. But
Yeah,
on bird feeders, you're mixing up different species.
Mm.
And it's also an issue with, for example, harp trapping of bats, where you're putting species that might not normally come into contact in close proximity.
I mean, there is
creating that
yeah.
that nursery type situation of germ sharing.
I mean, you do get that a little bit with sort of cats and dogs and rats and hedgehogs, or you know, but you can with hedgehogs, you can create a feeding station that other animals are unwilling to go in just by having a tunnel with basically a flap at either end. Hedgehogs will happily go through those flaps. Other animals tend not to so much. So you can sort of exclude that problem.
And Sarah, Sarah, do you want to speak live or are you still having problems with your mic? Because you've typed your question. Sarah's question is climate change an issue for indirectly adding to hedgehog health issues? I encounter hedgehogs that are either dehydrated or suffering from lung or tick issues. Are these imbalances the result of climate?
Probably. I mean, it's very difficult to pin these things down. In my book, I provide an anecdote about a village near Oxford called Kirtlington, where they'd done everything to make hedgehogs welcome. You know, it was hedgehog paradise. And then we had that really, really hot and dry spring during the first lockdown, and all the hedgehogs disappeared. And they probably disappeared from basically the suspicion is that what happened was the dry weather affected the abundance of earthworms for badgers. Badgers started to starve and they started to come into the village. This is my suspicion, and it's kind of borne out by the evidence to a certain degree. And so there were badgers being seen in the village, and people were hearing hedgehogs kind of being eaten by badgers, and finding hedgehog skins around, and then the hedgehogs left. So it was probably a combination of badgers looking for food as a result of climate change, which had affected the abundance of earthworms during that period, that meant that hedgehogs got eradicated from the village. Or that hedgehogs left because they too were dehydrated and they were looking for water elsewhere. So yes, I mean, there is very clearly an effect of climate change pervading all of these things. But again, it wouldn't be a problem if the fundamentals were all right, if the hedgerows were all intact, then none of this would be an issue. It becomes an issue because of the parlous state of, the parlous ecological state of UK farmland and its effect on the wildlife.
Right, it's just a couple of minutes to go before we have to finish at 7. So I'd just like to say thank you very much, Tom. I think we've actually got through all the questions, which is great. I'd just like to highlight the fact that on the 23rd of March, we've got our next discussion meeting. Again, 6 to 7. These happen on the 3rd Thursday of every term time month. And we do our best to have really interesting speakers. You can catch up on past discussions on our YouTube channel, and we'll share the link to that, and we'll share a link to the site for reporting hedgehog and other roadkill when we share the recording, which will go to everyone who booked on this webinar. The next one on the 21st of March will be 5 years in district licensing for great crested newts. Now that won't be recorded because some of the data is not yet published. So if you book on it, then you have to actually attend, I'm afraid. We have already had more bookings than we can handle on the Zoom, so we're already at over 100 for that. So again, it's going to be changed to this webinar format, which gives us a bit of trouble with our screen sharing and things, but seems to work quite well for the larger numbers. So with that, I'll say I want to stop recording, and we'll say goodbye to everyone. Thank you very much